liberty of action. Now, of course, speaking is an action. Okay, but as to, so what he's talking about here really is actions other than speech. He thinks actions involving speech acts should be, there should be total liberty with respect to that, and we'll be getting into that connection between speaking and acting and the like later on. But let's talk now more paradigm actions. So why do we need liberty of action? Why, within the bounds of the harm principle, should we be allowed to act however we want? I mean, yeah. Oh, you want to see the presentation this time? I guess I don't object. Well, what he says is, Mill gives three general sorts of arguments, and I think this bit of the textbook is really sort of over-edited. A lot of important stuff is left out. He says people need to have liberty of action because we need experiments in living. Famous phrase. And this is very much like the same reasons we need freedom of thought and expression, to try out ways of life for their usefulness and to demonstrate their use or disutility to others, as an example for others. So we need experiments in living to see what works. If we prohibit people from behaving certain ways, we won't know whether their behaving that way actually makes them happy or makes other people happy, or, right? So we need to tolerate, people behaving in ways that turn out not to be good, so that we can, right, be sure that in fact those ways aren't good and other people can learn from them. But secondly, let me say, with respect to some sorts of activities, it's a little bit absurd to argue that we need to allow people to indulge in them so that we can learn their value or the value of avoiding them. So, suicide, utter crackheadedness. I mean, there are some, you would think there are some ways you could spend your time that are perhaps not harmful to others, where we could say right in advance, no, that's stupid. That's not in anybody's interest. You're just nuts if you think otherwise. So, right, this idea that we got to let people do everything that doesn't directly harm others, so that we can find out whether in fact it's a bad idea. No, we tried crackheadedness and it's not good. We tried meth addiction. We tried we tried smashing your head against the wall repeatedly. Turns out not a good thing. Okay, stop that. Don't do that. But he gives another argument, and this we can call the epistemic argument, which is just that people are the best judges of their own good. They are in the best place to know whether an action makes them happy and are most certain to have their own interests at heart. Individuals are epistemically best suited to know whether some action is good for them. He says, here I'll just read the quote that's on the slide. The strongest arguments against interference of the public with purely personal conduct is that when it does interfere, the odds are that it interferes wrongly and in the wrong place. Now, this argument, insofar as it makes the empirical claim that individuals always know their interests better than others do, is just wildly implausible. Remember, Mill himself admits exceptions. In the case of minors, whose rational faculties aren't fully developed, right? In the case of the uncivilized who have not attained the age of reason, right? But why should we think that attaining the age of reason is some sort of a bright line, an all or nothing thing, a line which, when we cross it, we are for that reason better than anyone else at knowing our own good? And aren't we sort of piecemeal irrational anyway, right? We're quite reasonable and rational about some things and not so much about others. So this claim that people are always the best judges of their own good, unless you reduce it to a definition in the style of economists, right? If it's meant as a substantive claim, a substantive empirical claim, it just doesn't seem right. In any event, it is a contingent empirical question. And because of that, and as we'll see, Gerald Dworkin is going to make this claim, it can't underwrite an absolute prohibition on interference with liberty, even in private conduct. Yeah.
Does Mill think, wait, let me see if I can put the distinction out. Does Mill think that sometimes, would he see that sometimes we're irrational and don't know? Or is he saying that we always know? If the substantive claims. Because it seems to me that there's something, it's one thing to say like, we don't have the fully rational understanding of what is good for us all the time. Like we have our flaws and our irrationality. And it's a different thing to say that other people can't be a judge of that.
So I think what he would say is that, yeah, people make mistakes, but as a rule, they are vastly less likely to make mistakes than anyone who would try to constrain their liberty with respect to their private conduct. And so, as a rule, we should have an absolute prohibition on, at least with respect to those who've attained this age of reason and are within the scope of the harm principle, we should have an absolute prohibition on infringing, on restricting their liberty with respect to their private conduct. It's not because they never make mistakes. And it's not because we couldn't maybe carve out a few little sorts of conduct that chances are it's always bad for them to do that. But he wants an absolute prohibition here. And the fact is, I think Mill is deeply incoherent. Okay, so I don't think he's going to get everything he wants here. And you can see this from the fact that he then goes on to offer a different kind of justification for an absolute prohibition, which is different in character. It's as though he realizes that this epistemic argument just isn't strong enough for what he wants. So, and this is what Dworkin, Gerald Dworkin, not Ronald Dworkin, will say. This is what Dworkin says in the article you were supposed to have read. Yeah, Mill actually rests on this next argument. So, and this is something like the value of individuality itself, the value of being allowed to make up your own mind about what conduct you want to engage in. That is not instrumentally valuable for the happiness that it yields and the utility it yields, but it's intrinsically valuable. He says, a man's mode of laying out his existence is best, not because it is best in itself, but because it is his own. He who lets the world choose his plan of life needs only the ape-like faculty of imitation. He who chooses the plan for himself employs all his faculties. So Mill has a lot to say about this that is left out of our text. And it's of interest because he tries so hard to link it to utilitarianism via an extremely strong conception of what human happiness consists in, which is practically Aristotelian, eudaimonist in character. And this, though he tries to link it to utilitarianism, is really a very different kind of argument, which doesn't depend upon dubious empirical assumptions regarding our knowledge of our best interests or how to achieve them. And it might seem a better way to justify the harm principle with its absolute prohibition on restricting people's liberty in their private conduct. But note, whatever else may be said about this value of individuality, the mode of laying out his existence is best, his own mode of laying out his existence is best because it is his own, right? It's not a simple utilitarian argument. Okay. So, very different type of argument than the others, depending upon a substantive view of value. So what kind of life is worth leading? When Mill mentions moral retribution and punishment, this is to be contrasted with the law as punishment. Yes, he means censure by your fellows, being criticized, avoided, having people tut you. That's moral retribution. I'm pretty sure that's what he means there, Christopher. Okay. So in the excerpt that we have, Mill takes up two main challenges to his view regarding liberty of action. So this is, right, those are the justifications for the view. He takes up two main challenges to the view that people should have unlimited liberty with respect to their private conduct. And we'll be talking about private conduct a lot in a bit. One of them is that to restrict society from interfering with the private conduct of others is to restrict society's members' liberty of speech and action. Right? So how does, right, if we're not supposed to interfere with other people's private conduct, yet, right, one way to interfere with them is to tell them not to do it and to place various social burdens on them for doing it, right? If you're saying we can't do that, aren't you limiting our freedom of action? And Mill says, look, members of society can perfectly well censure other people's private conduct by a variety of things. Warning them, and he says you should warn people. Hey, if you smoke that, it's going to mess up your head, right? Avoiding them and their society, cautioning other people against them. Stay away from that crackhead fool, right? He'll be a bad influence on you. Stay away. Right? And giving others preference over people whose private conduct you don't like in discretionary matters where you have the authority to do so. Yeah.
So yeah, that was, I guess, something that as well. That how Mill would influence that their actions by others is not optimal. That'd be like his caution others that individual.
Yeah, you could do that, but again, Mill is, if someone is behaving in a certain way, which leads lots of other people to do the same thing, then Mill would be like, well, maybe that shows it's actually a good way to behave. But where we know that it's not a good way to, we're very confident it's not a good way to behave, certainly express your warn other people away from them. Yeah. But the point is, or rather, what makes this all acceptable, even though it provides serious disincentives for people to behave in certain ways, and that's a kind of infringement on their liberty. It imposes costs on them for their behavior. What he says is, you can do all of that, but you can't do it to punish them. That is, you can't do it from the motive to harm them for their private conduct. Okay? You can't do it in order to harm them for their private conduct. You can do it to save them from the consequences of their private conduct, save other people from exposure to them, right, etc., but not as a punishment for their private conduct. Now, this is interesting because Mill's a utilitarian, and in general, motive doesn't matter to utilitarians. They're not supposed to care about the motive for an action, it's the consequence for actions. So he must be saying something like this. Well, if you're motivated to harm them, then the kinds of things you're going to do, even though he's saying you can't, here are the things you can do, but you can't do those things out of a motive to punish. Right? So if they're really exactly the same things, what difference does it make what the motive is? But what he must be thinking is, well, if you do those kinds of things out of that motive, you will do them in a way that is counter-utilitarian. But anyway, it's just weird to see Hume saying, well, don't do them out of the motive to punish them. But sort of more important, I think, is this question how robust is this distinction really between warning someone they shouldn't do something, telling other people to avoid them, cautioning them, other people against them, right? How deep is the difference between doing those things and simply prohibiting somebody from doing something? That is to say, you can impose an enormous cost on someone in terms of these acceptable forms of censure. How much, right? How close is that to just prohibiting the conduct? Right? I mean, remember how the tyranny of the majority works. It doesn't necessarily work by passing laws. It works by moral censure of various kinds. And right, this is pretty severe, right? Ostracizing people, criticizing people, ostracizing them, cautioning other people against them, and not giving them the job or the perk or the whatever because of what they do in their private lives, as it were. Yeah. Because you're not doing it to harm them. Right? For him, punishment is, in principle, done from a motive to harm someone. So he thinks we should never punish anybody. He thinks the sole point of censure of any kind is to promote utility. If your motive is to promote utility, then when you put somebody in jail, you're not punishing them. Your point isn't to harm them. Your point is to use them to, right, use their case as an example so as to, right, first of all, deterrence, specific and general, and second of all, deterrence, right? That's that. So we're going to talk about punishment. We're going to have a whole section on punishment, but it's certainly acting against their interests in various costly ways. But if you're not doing that to harm them, you're not punishing them. Right? When your parent says, I'm doing this to you for your own good, right? I'm not trying to harm you, I'm trying to educate you, right? That's discipline, but it's not punishment, say. I mean, let's not quibble over the words. I mean, what's important here is he says, you can't do it just in order to harm them because you don't like what they're doing. All right. Suppose we have a majority that's utterly convinced of the immorality of some sort of private behavior. Can't the majority be tyrannical with respect to that minority simply by employing all of these means that Mill allows, avoiding them, right, etc. And that could be pretty damn harsh. Now, it should be, I mean, any of you know the Dr. Seuss book, The Sneetches? Yeah, I mean, those with stars upon bars, right? Just hate those without the stars upon bars, and they make them miserable. And then, of course, the tides turn, et cetera, but mere prejudice, dislike of someone for what is effectively just private conduct, can lead people to be horrible to one another in ways that are short of actual prohibition or the motive to harm, right? And so I'm just not sure. I mean, my point is just, right, Mill has said we can't infringe on other people's liberty of action. And in response to the claim, well, doesn't that restrict my liberty? There's a lot of stuff you can do, right? And it seems to be maybe not just as bad as direct prohibition. It's still pretty damn tyrannical, can be pretty tyrannical. Right? I mean, we think, notice he says preferring others to them in discretionary matters, right? So think here of just, I don't know, homosexuality. He's saying, oh yeah, it's perfectly okay to prefer other people to the homosexuals when it comes to hiring them. Not to punish them, but just because you don't like what they do. And you prefer others. You prefer to be around others. So that, I mean, there's plenty of room for tyranny left if we can do these things. That's my point. It should be mentioned, Hume argues that there's a difference between the kind of harm you suffer by defeat of prudence or personal dignity. Right? There's a difference between that, which is by implication the sort of thing you suffer by people's avoiding your society, by being cautioned, having people cautioned against you by these means. These are harms that arise from defeat of prudence or personal dignity. He says that's different from like direct harm. Defeat of prudence would be like, you decide, hey, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to decide in my private time to just smoke a lot of dope or to do a lot of heroin or something like that. And, you could be harmed by the fact that you end up like losing your job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's defeat of prudence. You made a bad choice. That's bad, but somehow that's not as bad as the direct harm that would be caused if we prohibited you from shooting up or whatever. Yeah, Sam.
I guess I'm kind of curious, like, how does this answer the challenge? Because he's saying like the challenge is that restricting society from interfering with private conduct, restricting their action, and so he's kind of saying like, yeah, sure, but here are your alternative.
No, these are the kinds of actions you can engage in. You're not restricted from doing these things, from warning people against them, warning people not to do certain things, right? As long as you don't do these things out of a punitive motive, you're at liberty to do them. Your liberty, my liberty to be a jerk in my private affairs or stupid in my private affairs does not mean you don't have the liberty to tell me I'm being a jerk, tell other people I'm being a jerk, right? Avoid you, etc. So, right? I mean,
sorry.
yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
He is admitting the last part of that challenge, right? That yes, you are restricted from actually.
Yeah.
So he's like admitting that, but he's like, well, you.
Well, the whole harm principle obviously says there are things you can't do to other people. It restricts the liberty of the majority to, for example, prevent the minority from behaving the way they want to in their private lives, in private affairs, right? So the harm principle is a principle of, for every liberty you grant someone, you're restricting somebody else's liberty. If you have the liberty to be free of murder, I do not have the liberty to murder you. Okay, so there's not going to be a case in which granting a liberty doesn't constrain somebody.
That seems to be.
Yeah, no, it's right. If we're truly not to, I mean, he's saying you don't. Your liberty is limited to an extent, but it's not limited insofar as you can do these things. And the point is, well, if you give them that much liberty, then that can be used in a tyrannical way. And the whole idea here is we want to avoid the tyranny of the majority. Can you really do it if you allow them to do this? Anyway, it's a tension, and it's a difficult compromise to make. Okay. The other challenge. The other challenge is the serious one, is the really serious one. It's the philosophically interesting one. Look, what he's saying is people should have complete liberty for self-regarding acts. That is, acts that affect only themselves. And the fact is, there are no self-regarding acts in that sense. Every action, maybe even every thought, since thoughts lead to actions, in fact, does affect others than the agent. Think here of hate speech, for example. Think here of opportunity costs in the form of people developing habits that waste their talents and energies and resources so as to make them less able to contribute to society and to discharge their responsibilities. Think of just giving offense by your actions. Okay? So think of behaviors that harm others by providing poor examples. Right? Habits whose harms to others may be quite serious but diffuse. The thing is, Mill admits all of this. Right? Top of the first column on page 381. He basically admits all of this. Yeah, well, that's right. There are really no purely self-regarding acts. What he does is he tries to articulate a principle that's supposed to allow us to distinguish self-regarding acts now as a protected category, right? Rather than as a category of acts understood as acts that have no consequence for anyone but the agent. So my point is this. He's going to tell us, he's going to give us something like a formula for what we're supposed to understand self-regarding acts to be, which is different from the idea that, well, they're just acts that don't affect anybody else. Because he realizes, well, they do affect other people. but we still want to permit them, even though they affect other people, even though they can harm other people. We want to permit them. So we better have a different way of understanding what that category of protected action is than just action that doesn't harm other people. So what is that? Right? He thinks we can distinguish self-regarding acts as a protected category from acts that can be regulated even though they may cause harm to others. So here's what he says, a bunch of quotations. When a person is led to violate a distinct and assignable obligation to any person or persons, the case is taken out of the self-regarding class and becomes amenable to moral disapprobation in the proper sense, to punishment. Okay, so there we get the idea of a person's actions leading to a violation of a distinct and assignable obligation. Right? He then goes on, whenever there's a definite damage or a definite risk of damage, either to the individual, an individual or the public, the case is taken out of the province of liberty and placed in that of morality or law. But now here's where we talk about, here's where he's going to talk about the kinds of harms that you can cause by your private conduct that can't be regulated. With regard to the merely contingent, or as it may be called, constructive injury, which a person causes to society by conduct which neither violates a specific duty to the public nor occasions perceptible hurt to any assignable individual except himself, the inconvenience, now this kind of other harm, right, is called an inconvenience. The inconvenience is one society can afford to bear for the sake of the greater good of human freedom. So summing it up here, it looks like for Mill, liberty extends to any act that neither violates a distinct and assignable obligation, nor causes perceptible harm to any assignable individual other than the agent. So you can assign a perceptible harm to an individual, right, other than the agent, right? When neither of those things is true, right, the action is permissible. Okay? Liberty extends to an action that doesn't violate a distinct and assignable obligation or cause perceptible harm. So, for example, drunkenness that makes you unable to pay your debts or unable to support or educate your children, that's properly subject to punishment. But what you're punishing there is the violation of the obligation, not the drunkenness. Okay? So, now, let's ask. Yeah.
So maybe this is what you're getting to, but the terms assignable and obligation are doing a ton of work.
And definite harm and assignable, perceptible harm, they're doing a ton of work. Or rather, what I prefer to say is they're doing a ton of muddying up the waters. Okay? But assignable obligation, okay, is the one I want to, in a way, is what I'm going to focus on. But yeah, what about the problem of diffuse harms that could be very profound, but hard to assign to any particular individuals? So the harm of say, I don't know, the harm video games do, I sort of want to say, right? I mean, the harm that, the harms caused perhaps by pornography. So the harms caused by porn that represents women as to be, as there for screwing, and that's what they are, right? Who's assignable to, right? What's the obligation violated there, or the who is perceptibly harmed in a way that's definite? But that can be a diffuse harm of a very profound kind, which would escape Mill's, which would be nonetheless protected. That kind of expression would be protected. Now, I'm not saying, I see your hand, I'll get you in a second. I'm not saying that, well, therefore Mill's principle is wrong. What I'm saying is, notice how potentially harmful things can be that fall within the scope of Mill's protected class of actions. There can be terribly bad diffuse harms that are not directly assignable, etc. That's the point. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, like, outside, like, that fall under, like, for example, like, a person comes in, or a person sees something that, like, reminds them of a tragic event, they are harmed. How would that fall under, like, Mills?
Well, do you have, okay, here's the question to ask. Do you have an obligation not to harm them in that way? Does that violate an assignable or a distinct obligation? And here's the real problem. This is a good question because it gets me right to the main worry here. We got a circularity problem now. Self-regarding acts, that is, acts in the protected class, are now being defined as acts that do not violate duties or obligations. But look, what obligations I have depends upon what rights other people have. Right? So I have to know what kinds of harms other people have a right to be free from in order to know whether an act of mine that causes a harm is protected or not. We've got a logical problem here. If I don't know whether you have a right to be free of being harmed by triggering speech, okay? If I don't know that, then, right, that's whether my right to speak whether I have a right to speak like that depends upon whether you have a right not to be triggered like that. So the logical point is that now that he's defining the protected class of actions in terms of what doesn't violate an obligation, right? Now we have to consider what harms we have a right not to suffer. And you can't determine one without the other. So this definition is now, it's empty, or without an account of what harms we have a right not to suffer, the account of what we have liberty to do is empty. So that just makes us face the question, what harms do I have a right to be free from? So let's consider hate speech. We could consider a whole lot of different examples, but let's just consider hate speech. Do I have the liberty to engage in hate speech? Well, that depends upon whether my engaging in hate speech violates the distinct and assignable interests of someone else. Well, does anybody have a right to be free of the harm of hearing hate speech? Well, that seems to depend upon whether I have the right to engage in it now, doesn't it? See? They're determining one without the other. But that's what we're trying to determine. Do I have the right to engage in hate speech? Or consider conduct I might engage in that you find super offensive. Suppose you find it massively offensive. Suppose indeed the majority of our culture finds it immoral and massively offensive. Do I have a right to engage in it? Well, that depends upon whether the harm done by my engaging in it is merely constructive. But whether it's merely constructive depends upon whether other people have a right not to suffer that kind of offense. So there's no question where Mill would come down in a case like this. You have to accept the offense, okay, in order that I may enjoy liberty. The question, though, is whether his analysis entitles him to that. Again, the critical point here is logical. In order to know whether an act is protected by the harm principle, I have to know what kinds of harms people have a right not to suffer. But to know what these are, I have to know what acts are protected by the harm principle. Right? The problem arises because we've had to recognize that there are, in fact, no or very, very few genuinely merely self-regarding acts. And now we have to define them instead in terms of not whether they harm anybody, but in terms of whether they harm them in a way they have a right not to be harmed. Which is just the same question, whether I have a right to engage in the behavior in the first place. So he's got himself in a logical pickle here. It'd be really good. Where would mask mandates stand according to Mill? Not wearing a mask is dangerous for those around you, and Mill would have no problem with mask mandates, I do not believe. And vaccine mandates, probably as well. That ain't private conduct. I want to say a little bit more about hate speech, because look, Mill would definitely say, you can't prohibit somebody from speaking just because what they're saying is offensive. He also says you can't prohibit somebody from doing something if the harm is not to an assignable individual. Right? There's at least two problems with hate speech. One of them is that people are offended by it. Okay? And Mill could say, offense is something we can tolerate. But another is that hate speech, like, for example, pornography that objectifies women and shows them as appropriate, targets of violence of various sorts, right? That doesn't just, it's not just offensive, it has the effect of recommending and normalizing attitudes and behaviors that are deeply harmful, but not to any assignable particular individual. Expressing racist attitudes, denigrating people because of their ethnic origin or their color, right? That's speech, and it's offensive, but it's not just offensive. And Mill doesn't seem to have the tools to deal with the kinds of harm that can be produced by that kind of speech. He thinks it should be protected, and he doesn't have, I mean, look, what I'm saying here is, I'm not saying we shouldn't protect that speech. It might well be, on balance, better to permit it than to regulate against it. The left, the political left, used to be the very most serious, defender of free speech, but now it's come around. And on the political left, there's a lot of sentiment that says, your speech when it's harmful, you should be silenced one way or another for it. And they're not just saying you should be silenced because you're offending me. They're saying speech is a powerful tool that can be used in ways that are oppressive to classes of people. And I don't know the answer here, but it's not just a simple appeal to Mill isn't going to do the trick. And not just a simple way of saying, not just some simple saying, well, you just got to be willing to be offended. Got to have thick skin. Because thick skin, right, it's not, that'll keep you from being offended, but it won't keep you from being oppressed. Whereas certain kinds of speech will produce oppression, can produce oppression in a way that's very hard to defend against. Yeah.
So the second problem with hate speech is it is a problem insofar as the speech has the actual consequence of producing a state of oppression.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's dependent on that particular.
Right, but oppression is a kind of diffuse harm that Mill, right, doesn't that Mill thinks is a merely constructive harm of a sort that we must tolerate in the name of freedom. So we have to tolerate kinds of speech that potentially can lead to oppression, which is hardly in the name of freedom, right? We have to tolerate it in the name of freedom. I don't have any answers here. I just think it's a really, really, really deep, hard problem, and we can't gloss over it by just saying, free country, man, or First Amendment, I have a right. Yeah, you have a right to be a total asshole. That doesn't mean you should do it, or we shouldn't be. Maybe we shouldn't give you that right because it's dangerous and harmful. Many other other countries do not. They're free. They have freedom of expression, but not to the extent that we tolerate it here. And this is an awfully divided, hateful land where some of those other places are not quite so bad in that regard. Anyway, yeah, Christopher, that's a good point. But the drunkenness is a problem because it leads to a violation of distinct obligations. And it's the violation of the distinct obligations that you can punish. But what's the analog in the case of hate speech to the violation of a distinct obligation? That's the problem. Yeah.
So, Mill, I guess, are you to be omniscient? Certain room, say the same thing, have everyone, different people, essentially know what you're saying, categorize.
I don't, you're not giving me enough context. So he's talking about restrictions on people's liberty, right? So should we prohibit or punish hate speech is the question. Well, not on the grounds of its offensiveness. I don't think people should, maybe, but my personal opinion is, no, people should take a thick skin and not, the mere offensiveness of speech should not be enough to restrict it. But the harms of hate speech are not limited to its offensiveness, and that's the problem. Even if we agree that people should put up with being offended, then there's the question, okay, but do they have to put up with people speaking in a way that can be predicted to yield, systematic oppression. And systematic as opposed to distinct and assignable. Right? It's not that I'm afraid if someone engages in hate speech, a particular person, we can trace that to a particular person's not getting not getting something they were entitled to. That's not how diffuse harms work. Yeah, well, I mean, each particular act is going to have its own particular consequences. But then there's the consequences of permitting acts of a class, say hate speech, right? And there will be some offense, but there can also be expected to be some other stuff. And, otherwise there would be no point to political rhetoric, right? I mean, if it didn't work in mysterious ways to have effects on people and get them to exhibit one or the other kind of preference in their behaviors, right? People, that's what it's for. And speech has these kinds of consequences as well. And I'm not saying we shouldn't value freedom of speech. My own view has traditionally been, I've been more or less of a enthusiast for the First Amendment. But I do recognize there are theoretical problems here, which it is easy to gloss over. So more or less as a pragmatist, I believe we should have a very robust First Amendment. But that doesn't mean that I don't see the costs as real costs of doing this. And I think some people are like just absolutists, And I think, looking at Mill carefully shows you why this is actually such a deep problem, such a thorny area. All right. That's what I have to say about Mill directly. Now let's turn to Gerald Dworkin's paper on paternalism, which I think is here somewhere. There it is. So, in this paper, Dworkin criticizes Mill's arguments against paternalistic laws. So paternalistic laws are laws that, in general, try to keep people from harming themselves. Okay, it's one thing to keep people from doing things that harm others. It's another thing to try to keep people from doing things that harm themselves. The latter is paternalism. So you can define it, or anyway, Dworkin defines it: interference with a person's liberty of action justified by reasons referring exclusively to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values of the person being coerced. Now, there's always going to be, or typically will be, more than one reason for a piece of legislation. So a piece of legislation might be unjustified as paternalistic, but justified in some other way. So not every law which seeks to prevent people from harming themselves seeks only to do that. And so a piece of legislation that might be paternalistic might be justified on grounds other than paternalistic grounds. So just keep that in mind. So, and here, by the way, Dworkin is now talking about paternalism in the law, particularly. Mill was talking about liberty, both, with basically prohibiting paternalism, both with respect to law and the conduct of non-officials in society. Okay. So there are two basic sorts of paternalistic laws. These are laws that prohibit or punish actions directly, or laws that simply make it difficult or impossible to engage in certain kinds of actions. Where these barriers, right, in both cases, are justified on paternalistic grounds. So, for example, a direct law is like, okay, so you're not allowed to inject heroin. Okay, that's so you could have non-paternalistic justifications for that as well, but it leads to crime. Okay, but you're just trying to keep people from getting high, then that's paternalistic. Okay, the example of the second kind is, for example, not enforcing contracts that are against the contractor's interest. So yeah, you can enter into a contract to sell your labor for the rest of your life for a nickel a day. Okay? But we're not going to let you actually do that. We're not going to enforce any such contract. Right? You can do it, but we're going to make it very, very hard, right? There's another sort of arguably paternalistically motivated kind of strategy here that Dworkin isn't going to discuss, and that's things like giving incentives for self-helping actions or subsidies for, right? So we're going to give you a tax break for investing in whatever. So what's a self-helping action? For investing in your own education, right? If you can prove that you've spent money on tuition, we'll give you a break in your taxes. That would be incentivizing people to do things that are good for them. Okay? In a way, that's paternalistic. It's trying to get them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do because you think it's good for them. Or, for example, giving poor people food stamps instead of cash because you think if they have the cash, then they might not use it for the food that they actually need. Right? Okay. So, now, it's possible to have paternalistic laws which it's not necessary for paternalism to be coercive with respect to the person whose benefit is sought. Right? So let's call laws in which the person who is coerced is not the person whose benefit is sought, call that impure paternalism. Okay? So, for example, professional licensing laws. I'm not allowed to practice medicine unless I have a license. And the reason I'm not is to protect everyone else. I'm coerced, right? I'm the one who's forced to go to medical school and get a license before I can do something. But it's not for my benefit, it's for other people's benefit. And then there's another sort of category here that you might think is paternalistic, but he says isn't. And these are laws that facilitate what people would in fact like to have happen, but can only make happen through legislation. So, for example, clean air laws. Everybody wants the air to be clean, okay? But you got a giant coordinating problem, and it's not going to happen. Everybody would like there to be restrictions on, and this may not be the best example, but there are various kinds of things that people in fact would want that they can only get through legislation because of the scale of what has to be done in order to make it happen. Right? These are laws passed for those people's goods that they can't bring about themselves. But what makes it not paternalistic is the fact that that's what they want. Helping somebody get what they want isn't paternalistic, right? Making making them do things because you think it's good for them whether they want it or not, that's paternalistic. Keeping them from doing things because you think that's not good for them even though they want to do it, that's paternalistic. But helping people get things that they want that they can't get without your help, that's not paternalistic. That's the basic point. Okay. So he now turns to Mill's arguments with which we are familiar. So we can go through them pretty quickly. The individual is the best judge of their own good and most certain to have their interests at heart. This is what I call the epistemic argument. Right. So again, to quote Mill, the strongest arguments against interference of the public with purely personal conduct is that when it does interfere, the odds are that it interferes wrongly and in the wrong place. But this claim is an empirical claim and has been widely and rightly criticized. Remember, Mill himself acknowledges exceptions, children, those who have not attained the age of reason. And at best, it supports a presumption against paternalism, but not a flat prohibition, not an absolute prohibition, which is what Mill recommends. Okay, so Dworkin quotes Hart here, and I want to read the Hart quote. Mill endows the average individual with too much of the psychology of the middle-aged man whose desires are relatively fixed, not liable to artificial stimulation, who knows what he wants and what gives him satisfaction or happiness, and who pursues these things when he can. Yeah, if that's what you think people are like, then it's plausible to say individuals are the best judge of their own good. But that's not what people are like. That is not what the run-of-the-mill person is like, not the middle-aged man with the relatively fixed desires, not liable to artificial stimulation. All right. Another exception that Mill himself acknowledges is when an individual attempts to decide irrevocably now what will be best for his interest at some future time. Okay, so we shouldn't accord people the liberty to decide irrevocably now what will be in their interest in the future. Now, in light of that, in light of the implausibility of the claim as an empirical matter, in light of the fact that it doesn't support an absolute prohibition on paternalism, which is what Mill is after, and that Mill himself acknowledges exceptions, in light of that, this utilitarian epistemic argument, right, Dworkin thinks it's just not adequate to ground Mill's absolute prohibition, and it's not, that absolute prohibition really isn't, he thinks, grounded for Mill in this epistemic argument. Rather, the actual basis for Mill's absolute prohibition on paternalistic legislation is the non-utilitarian claim that a man's mode of laying out his existence is the best, not because it's the best in itself, but because it is his own, what I call the individuality for its own sake argument before. But, and here is really where Dworkin's article takes off, if liberty is good for its own sake, then infringements on it might be justified to preserve a wider range of freedom for the individual in question. Right? We might, right, if the point of avoiding paternalism is to promote liberty, then there might be situations in which we can paternalistically promote liberty by prohibiting people from doing things that will compromise their capacities to make choices in the future, to exercise their liberty in the future. And an example is slavery. You don't let people sell themselves into slavery. Can't do it. Right? Why not? Why can't I now just indenture myself in perpetuity to you as slave labor? Well, because if it's truly slavery, if I'm making myself your property, then I am foregoing my rights to self-determination. If the point of the general point of a prohibition against paternalism is to respect people's right to self-determination, then it's consistent with that main point to limit people's right to do things that compromises their capacity for self-determination. Yeah, Sam.
Can you explain real quick again the base or like the reasons you think that that you were saying earlier that the valuing freedom for its sake, liberty for its sake argument?
Well, okay, I didn't. Okay. Thanks for stopping by. Okay, so Mill talks a great deal and stuff that is not in your excerpt about the connection between individuality and the full exercise of human capacities, of distinctly human capacities. That latter, that's right, promoting a substantive view of what human excellence consists in, which is very much in line with Aristotle's. Right? If it would be silly to say that human individuality is valuable just for the sake of variety, or just so that people can be, unique. Why is uniqueness good? Right? It just means you're not the same as other people, as someone else. Why is that in itself a value? But if exercising your individuality, right, by making your own choices, by choosing your own good, is a way of directing, of exercising the higher human faculties in a and thereby exemplifying human excellence, then you can understand why that's a value. So that's what I mean by saying the value he places on individuality is kind of Aristotelian. But you could equally well say that it's Kantian, or rather, that I think Dworkin is making more of a Kantian interpretation of it here, where where liberty, where autonomy and self-determination are intrinsically tied to human dignity. Slightly different. Aristotle, it's like tied to human excellence. Kant, it's tied to human dignity and the only thing that's of worth in itself. So those are the two greatest philosophers, by the way, Aristotle and Kant, and they both value human rational capacities and their exercise, but they do it in slightly different ways. Okay, where am I? At the end of this slide. Let's see if we have time for another one. Yeah, I think we can get through this. So if paternalism can be justified on the same basis that ordinarily prohibits it, that is, on the basis that people should be allowed to determine, people's capacities for self-determination should be right. We want to promote people's capacity and not get in the way of people's capacity for self-determination. Right? That provides a possible justification for paternalism. in the case in which you keep people from doing things that they want to do that would be bad for their capacities for self-determination. So when is it acceptable? Well, everyone agrees it's acceptable for children. Okay? Why? Well, because they're not yet capable of making fully rational decisions. But Dworkin says, and this I think is actually interesting and probably not true, that this, substituting, the parents substituting their own decisions for what the child wants. So the legitimacy of that is conditioned on the idea that the child will eventually come to see that the parent was right to do that. That is to say, the child will come to see that the child himself should have wanted what the parent wanted for the child. And he takes this to be a kind of after-the-fact consent. We have to think, so this is the leading idea here, is we have to think of paternalism and its justification in terms of the idea that the person whom we are coercing via our paternalistic treatment would themselves, in the end, consent to what we had done. They would come to see that they themselves, had they been, right, had they, been thinking the way that they now recognize as being better, they would have agreed. And it's real important how we understand this sort of approach. It's not what he calls what's the sorry, there's a word for this, and I didn't put it in the slide. It's not what's called real will theory, where you just say, well, if the person were thinking properly, they would agree. Right? We're fully rational, they would agree. They would or would not want X, right? Because real will theory often ignores the idea of actual or even hypothetical consent. Like, we're going to keep you from doing something because if you were rational, you wouldn't want to do it. That's different from saying, we're going to keep you from doing something because you yourself would recognize and may come to recognize, we hypothesize that you yourself would agree that this is better for you. That's the difference I highlight on the slide. It's not thinking of people, not thinking in terms of if that person were thinking properly, but thinking instead, it's reasonable to suppose they would in fact come to agree, given who they are and their preferences and their overall preferences, overall psychological structure, desires about what kind of person they want to be. Even given all of that, they would agree that we were right to restrict them in this way. And that's different from saying if they were rational, they would agree. Yeah.
It's not hard to fit with situations of that don't look like I'm thinking of suicide and the seatbelt. Those two examples. It doesn't.
Great.
It's harder to do with the seatbelt thing.
It's super hard to do with the seatbelt thing for exactly the reasons that we're going to talk about next time. So, right, we're over time now. But yeah, that's going to be the real trick. Just to foreshadow, the real trick is going to be having some principled way to distinguish between people's irrational desires and they're simply having different preference orderings than we do. That's the trick. And that's very hard to do. But we'll pick that up next time and move on to the... Actually, I may decide to cancel the next reading, Hart and Devlin, but maybe I won't. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. But we'll pick up with unless you hear from me, there will be no change in the syllabus. So there you go. Okay, sorry for going over. Thanks for your patience. Blah, blah, blah. Have a nice day. Have a nice weekend. Or actually have whatever kind of day and weekend you want, so long as it's not based on an irrational desire pattern.